Ask Muvi send those questions and comments, of course I will be able to pick one or two questions and forward them to our guest on the program. Now today we get to discuss some of the findings from the 2021 general elections. Bearing in mind that there has been, or we have a lot of stakeholders that give an input to ensuring to the change of government, and these are persons living with disabilities, among other stakeholders in this country. And of course, for a long time, we've only engaged the other aspect of individuals, and we thought it wise today to set a special day for to hear from our colleagues. These are leaders coming from the Zambia Federation for Persons with Disabilities. Or let me read that again. The Zambia Federation for Disability Organizations, that's ZAFOD. And my guest on the program is Annette Soko, who happens to be ZAFOD Elections Programs Manager. She's here to make her first appearance and help us some of the findings that came out from the 2021 general elections, and above all, what is it now that they are looking for, or she is advocating on behalf of her members. Madam Soko, welcome to the assignment.
Okay, thank you so much, Innocent, and good evening, viewers.
Thank you so much. How is ZAFOD to start?
ZAFOD is okay.
Thank you.
We just hope that, we just hope and expect so much from the New Dawn government, and we hope that as we speak inclusion, we're going to see persons with disabilities taking center stage or taking meaningful participation in the governance of this country. Yes, please.
It's interesting. We've started the program a bit late, and we try by all means to cruise with our discussion, but let's begin by maybe just give a quick reminder to the people of Zambia, for them to understand who ZAFOD is and vis-a-vis the mission of ZAFOD as we move on.
So ZAFOD is Zambia Federation for Disability Organizations. We exist to promote the rights of persons with disabilities. And so as an organization, we are made up of about 15 affiliates, hence the federation. So we have 15 affiliate members. These affiliate members are different groupings of persons with disabilities. For example, we have ZNAB, which is the Zambia National Association of the Blind. Yes, then we also have an association for persons with disabilities who are women. We have an association for the deaf, among others. So those make up 15 of our affiliate members, and we have received a lot of interest from other disability associations that are not yet affiliated with us to come on board. So basically that's that. ZAFOD is about promoting and protecting the rights of persons with disabilities.
In bringing something very cardinal in terms of the affiliation, you just mentioned that some of your members or some of your stakeholders, the people you are anticipating to get affiliated to this organization, what does it take for one to get affiliated to ZAFOD, really?
Okay, there is a process which I may not exhaust here, but usually the persons within the disability movement are aware of that. So we do request them when they come to the ZAFOD Secretariat in Woodlands, and so we share with them the process for them to join. So there are certain requirements that they need to fulfill, which I may not exist here in the interest of time, but that is the procedure. But all disability associations in the civil society or in the civil society arena are welcome.
All right.
Yes.
Let's get to the governance aspect of the ZAFOD, of course, the general aspect of Zambia's governance, and what role is ZAFOD really playing to the governance of this country?
So ZAFOD is about promoting the participation. I already talked about the rights of persons with disabilities. We also advocate for their meaningful participation in governance. And by this, we mean that we need to see persons with disabilities being included in the governance processes of this country. So as per our theme today, as ZAFOD, we monitored the 2021 general elections to see the extent or to assess the extent to which the electoral process was inclusive of persons with disabilities, both as voters and also as candidates. So that means that we had persons with disabilities who were also seeking representative leadership. And so as ZAFOD, we are looking to say, have they been elected? And if they have not been elected, in what way are our members going to get representation of one of their own? Yes, so in the areas of governance, we've done so much. We do advocacy for the participation of persons with disabilities in the governance process at different levels. We engage stakeholders, we engage the government, we work with political parties to make sure that they mainstream disability in their programming, and also that their structures are inclusive of persons with disabilities, and that their membership is accommodative and accepting towards persons with disabilities within the party. We also look to see that, or to assess the extent to which political parties have got or inclusive policies for persons with disabilities to participate in their activities, for example. And also ZAFOD is on record as having or promoting, or actually developed a position paper on mixed member electoral system. That's the type of representation that we are recommending and advocating for. So basically that has been our work in governance, and this time around we are presenting the election observation findings to speak to our assessment, and also to show you the results for our assessment, and also just to open up discussions around what happens next for persons with disabilities. How do they get represented? How do they find themselves in the governance structure? How do they find themselves taking part meaningfully in the governance of this country? Yeah.
We are aware that you and I, and of course the people that are watching this program, that the 2021 general elections, I think, was highly contested. You know,
That's
and I'm
true.
glad you just mentioned that you had embarked on a journey to establish some of the thematic areas, or the findings of what transpired in the last general elections. Maybe we could be lucky, together with my viewers out there, what are some of the findings that you came across? You've talked about the issues to do with human rights, of course, the participation of your people into various political positions, and also just attending that free and fair general elections. What are some of the thematic areas that you looked at?
Okay, so first of
recommendations?
all, okay, so ZAFOD monitored both the pre-election environment and the election day. So in the pre-election environment, from the 15th of July to the 11th of August, we recruited and deployed 20 monitors that were observing the electoral proceedings leading up the August 12th elections in 60 districts of this country, covering all the 10 provinces. So the pre-election observation, our focus was to see the messaging, what messages were coming out from political parties, from voters, from candidates, what message did they have for the electorate in the election. We're also looking at political party activities. How were the campaigns proceeding? We're also monitoring how the campaigns were being conducted with reference to COVID-19. As you know that this year's election was held under strict COVID-19 adherence measures. Then we're also looking at the preparedness of the ECZ in the election. So one of the key issues that came out from the pre-campaign period is that, first of all, we had 12 candidates that were on the ballot on the 12th of August that were persons with disabilities. So one of the issues that these candidates faced was harassment from their opponents, messages that were derogatory.
Before we proceed, the 12 candidates that contested in this year's elections, those were at which level? Is it
Okay, great. So we had 5 at parliamentary level, 5 at council chairperson level, and 2 at local government level. That's at councillor level. So some of them were adopted by political parties, but we had 2 that stood as, 10 were adopted by political parties, 2 stood as independents. Yes. So we had those 12. So one of the issues they really faced was discriminatory messages from their opponents in the election. So you find that they were being decampaigned on the basis of their disabilities, where candidates or their competitors spoke to their disability as if it was something that would prevent them from representing their people adequately. So on that basis, we only had 1 person with a disability that made it at parliamentary level. At council chairperson level, we had 2, and the 2 at local government level both made it. But what I'm trying to say is that they made it after overcoming a lot of challenges, including the fact that they had to fight off stigma of their disability for them to convince the voters to vote for them. So for persons with disabilities, this election was not just about selling themselves to the people, but it was also about overcoming certain negative connotations or negative energy that was being thrown around them by their opponents. Other than that, we also saw that although political parties were campaigning, there was no message really that was specifically coming out for persons with disabilities. Even where it was mentioned, it was like as a by the way. So you would find that there was no proper plan where you can hear to say, okay, as persons with disabilities, these are the plans that party X has for you beyond the 2021 general elections. Other than that, the elections were characterized by a lot of violence. I think it was widely reported in the media. And so where you have violence and you have persons with disabilities participating both as voters and as candidates, it tends to impede them. Because they have some limitations with getting around their life already. So now imagine where they're in an environment that is characterized by violence. They tend to suffer more than persons without disabilities. So that was that about the pre-election environment. And then on election day, I think before I even got the findings as regards persons with disabilities, allow me to highlight the fact that on the part of the ECZ, the electoral conduct, or I mean the electoral code of conduct, or should I say the electoral code, was followed to a very large extent. At 89% of the polling stations that we observed, we had the required number of polling officials. For example, most polling stations, I think at about 100%, were open by 06:30, and you and me know that voting should start by at least 6 hours. So if they can start by 6:30, then they are within the time, looking at the different preparedness that different polling stations could face. So in that regard, the procedures in terms of voting, where voters had to present their IDs, their fingers checked, their details verified before they could be allowed to vote, that was adhered to. But for persons with disabilities, our findings are that the polling stations in the just ended 2021 general elections were not accessible for persons with disabilities, or should I say the electoral process was not accessible. When we speak of polling stations, most of them had narrow entrances. So narrow entrances meant that persons with disabilities, especially the ones on wheelchairs, could not go about their way to vote freely. Some of them, when they reached the entrance, they had to be lifted. Now, with being lifted comes a violation even to your body. I mean, nobody had access to your body because you had to vote. But persons with disabilities on wheelchairs had to undergo that. They go inside the booth. Those that managed to get to the booth, for example, on wheelchairs, the booth was way high for them to vote. So they had to use to vote from their laps. Okay. Other than the booth being high, it was not adjustable. It was very narrow. And so still, in other words, the booths were there, but voters on wheelchairs could not use them for that reason. Then we had voters who were deaf. There were no sign language posts around the polling stations. At about 67% of the polling stations that we observed, we did not have election day instructions for persons with disabilities. So they didn't even know how to go about their way. Of course, there was one consistent message that they were not going to queue. But even if they don't queue up, when they reach a polling station, what happens? Where do they go? Who receives them? There wasn't that kind of instruction. Then we had voters, we also had polling stations having no ramps. Only 3% of them had ramps. They had no handrails. Handrails, the support that you get as you go up the stairs. So you see, imagine a person on crutches, and then they're going upstairs. So we had stairs as well. We had steps. We had no ramps. We had no handrails. So it was really difficult for persons with disabilities to navigate the environment in order for them to cast their vote. So most of them that did that under a lot of challenges. Then we had voters who were visually impaired. Braille ballot jackets were provided for in about 43% of the polling stations that we observed. But they remained unused because the visually impaired voters that had access to them or that went to polling stations that had Braille ballot jackets supplied did not have they did not know how to use them. They were not sensitized on how to use the Braille ballot jackets. And also we had polling stations where we had visually impaired voters, but they were not supplied with Braille ballot jackets. So we had all these issues that for them to just cast their votes, persons with disabilities had to overcome a number of barriers. And in terms of the environment, some of the barriers were trenches, rocks, sand, troughs, all those were some of the barriers that persons with disabilities had to overcome in order for them to cast their vote. So to that effect, our conclusion is that the 2021 general elections were not accessible for persons with disabilities, or should I say the electoral process was not inclusive of persons with disabilities, and the polling venues were not accessible. That's our conclusion.
All right. Well, you just offloaded a lot of, pertinent points here. I'll take you back to the issue of accessibility to these public places. I know that this has been a concern for so many years now in this country by your members.
Exactly.
I remember at some point I personally have attended different workshops or public forums where people they begin to brainstorm in terms of how they can design maybe a building like Muvi TV to ensure that a person with disability, when he or she comes here, will quickly have access. But if you move around, you find that most of these buildings,
they're not accessible.
You get a point.
Yeah.
All right. So really, how best can we ensure that we achieve that agenda that you or your members want going forward? Okay.
So first of all, Innocent, I would like to put it on record that it is not expensive to make the environment accessible for persons with disabilities. It just calls for small adjustments and small decisions. But most importantly, I think it has to be at the back of every Zambian, at the back of every human being, to remember that persons with disabilities are persons just like you and me, number one. So they have inherent rights by virtue of them being human. But other than those rights, they also have rights as disability rights, which calls for the fact that they have to be accommodated to a certain extent. The challenge that has been there, or the reason why this has been ignored or this has been neglected, is the fact that out of the population in Zambia right now, an estimation is that only 10% are persons with disabilities. But you and me, because we don't have a disability today, we tend to think that persons with disabilities are just external people that we just find on wheelchairs, that we find. But those are our family members. They are our brothers and sisters. And if you don't have a disability today, you are potentially a person with a disability tomorrow. That's why we should all be concerned. So what I can say is that it is not expensive to make the environment accessible for persons with disabilities, but we need to make small adjustments here and there. And the first adjustment you need to do is in your planning. At planning stage, allocate some resources, or make sure that if you're planning a building, for example, from the word go, it is accessible. Put a ramp where it's supposed to be. Put handrails where they're supposed to be. Sometimes I laugh when I go to some buildings and they'll tell you, and you ask them, this building is not accessible for persons with disabilities, and then they'll tell you, no, but we have a lift. But to get to the lift, you have to go above the stairs. So now you ask them to say, okay, so if I come with someone on a wheelchair here, how will they access the lift which is over there? And then they'll tell you, no, we'll lift them. But then the question is, who is lifting you to get to the escalator or to get to the elevator? Nobody. So why should you feel a person with a disability needs to be lifted? They also want to go about their way freely. So it starts from there. As we plan, it can be a program, it can be a building, whatever it is that you are planning, can you make sure that every citizen is catered for? And when I say every citizen is catered for, can you make sure that if a person with a disability was to access that particular building or that particular environment on any day, they should be able to go about their way without having to rely on other people. So they should be able to move like any other citizen would. So the same way you and me are being planned for, can we also make sure that our planning includes persons with disabilities? Because they are citizens, they are among us. They are not excluded from what we are enjoying as citizens in this country.
All right. On the voting day, like you've mentioned, we did see a lot of persons with disabilities not being assisted, by able-bodied individuals. One of the, I think the incidents I saw was in Chilanga, somewhere there. And little did I know that there's also some aspects of, human rights as well.
Yes.
For me, when I saw people being assisted, I was actually quick to report that persons with disabilities, I think they are given that room, or they are being helped, which is okay, or which was okay, without really knowing the aspect of human rights. I want you just to emphasize that aspect, which you feel that it's not okay, it's not normal.
No, it's not. It's not right because, elections come every 5 years. Now, how often have we been having elections in this country?
Yeah.
Already, just to give you a picture, this is the 7th president that we've been having. So at the very least, it means we've had 7 presidential elections. So are you telling me that we're going to be celebrating our independence on the 24th of October, but we still have citizens that cannot even freely exercise their right to vote? That is laughable. It's unacceptable. I mean, in a democratic country that's such as ours, it shouldn't be happening. So if we're going to speak rights, we are a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. In this country, we have a Disability Act. We should begin to action some of these things that we commit ourselves to. So if we're going to talk elections, the question is, what sort of citizens do we have taking part in an election? You know, for me, having a polling station not accessible is the same as going to vote, and then ECZ tells you, because we had a low turnout last year, we only printed, say, 10,000 ballots. Meanwhile, they received 1 million ballots. Is that even something that you can imagine? No. It shouldn't be happening, like it's unheard of. So likewise, we should find it, we shouldn't find it acceptable that we can get to a polling station that is planned for way before elections take place, a venue that is accessed, not being accessible to some of the citizens. Because what are we telling them? We are telling them to say, yes, there's an election, but we don't want you to participate. This is why we are putting these barriers to exclude you. Somehow that is what you are saying. So, but if people, despite having disabilities, come forward and say, let us go and exercise our civic duty, they should find it accessible, just like any other person. And these are just 10% of our population, so we cannot fail to take care of them. So it's not an issue of resources. For me, it's just an issue of priorities. When we think of an election, what are we prioritizing? Because for persons without disabilities, there are buildings that are already available and accessible. And when I mean accessibility, innocent, I don't mean that you go to a school, break down a classroom and bring it down for persons with disabilities to vote. I mean that you should be able to make decision as the elections management body to say, okay, at this school, all the buildings have got stairs. Where then can persons with disabilities vote? Then you make a provision, even outside, on the downstairs, okay, on the ground floor. You make a provision and say persons with disabilities are going to vote from here. Then you put correct and appropriate signage. And then if you're going to have braille ballot jackets, make sure that the voters that you're targeting with that information, first of all, at registration level, are captured correctly. Target them with the messages suitable for them, and then make the election voting materials available. And also have the polling officials trained to assist those voters as they come. So that each and every Zambian begins to enjoy their right to vote in a dignified manner. Yes. So being assisted was a good thing, or it appears as a good thing. But for me, if they're being assisted for something that they could have done independently, but simply because the planning is sort of exclusive, then that is not being assisted.
I do agree with you. When you mentioned about that as a country, these elections were not an ambush to all of us. You know, it's something that we knew, or we always know 5 years before.
Exactly.
You know, and maybe someone is going to put a blame on you as, you know, the advocates, you know, because in as much as you might want to blame the 6 presidents we've had as a country, and now the 7th, in the name of UPND, President Hakainde Hichilema, again, there is also preparations which is supposed to be done by people like you. Your members are going to blame you that possibly you didn't do much advocacy on their behalf prior to the elections. How much engagement did you have with the government prior to that, or the ECZ?
Okay. Actually, on the contrary, you might want to know that as ZAFOD, we've been consistently engaging the ECZ on these issues. And we actually took the ECZ to court in 2011 on the same issue of accessibility of elections in this country. And the court ruled in our favor, where they agreed with us to say the electoral process in Zambia was not inclusive of persons with disabilities. But prior to us taking court action, we had been engaging the ECZ, and our engagement was not yielding. So in terms of engagement, we've done so much of it. Prior to these elections, we actually took part in monitoring the voter registration process, though we only monitored the voter registration extension. But we did engage the ECZ on the fact that they needed to register persons with disabilities by disability type, so that based on that, they could then plan the polling venues. But up to today, even when we request for disability disaggregated data, we have not gotten any response. So the question is, to what extent was that data actually collected, or was it even collected at all? And if it was collected, why did it not inform the planning process of accessibility of polling venues? In 2016, we had an action plan from the ECZ on how they were going to make the polling venues accessible. And our monitoring of the 2016 elections showed that 72% of the polling stations were at least accessible. But in this year's election, we went down. So it shows you to say, if at a planning stage, you ignore or you don't include all relevant stakeholders, you're going to fail. So that is what we saw.
In this case, you were not fully included.
We're not fully included, but not on the basis that we're not advocating enough or that we're not engaging them. But simply because, exactly, our voices were not heard. Our advice, our recommendations were not taken. Or even when they were taken, they were not implemented.
Right.
So from our membership, trust me, they have so much confidence in us because we are doing so much. We are advocating, we are speaking to these things. And even when these results came out, we had an engagement with the ECZ on the 8th of October. We shared with them these findings and we asked them why polling stations still remain inaccessible, despite the fact that we even have a court judgment that orders them to make polling venues accessible. So the excuse, of course, that you always get, the responses is that we are doing something about it, but we don't have adequate resources. But our argument as ZAFOD is that, look, you don't need resources to implement some of these changes. For example, how much resources, Innocent, does it take for you to say, at this particular polling station, can you make sure that no voter with disability actually goes up a stair or has to climb steps for them to go and vote? Can you make sure that they are voting from here? As they come from home, as they reach the polling venue, all the way from the entrance to the venue, up until they vote, it's accessible. To make a booth, for example, that is at table height, do you require extra resources for that? Because even if you have just one booth at every polling venue, that's okay. It's not like you're not going to have the booth. You have the booth, but it will just be at a level where even a person in a wheelchair can vote without being lifted. Other than that, if you use your data to plan, you realize that it's not every polling venue that will require those interventions, because some polling venues may not have persons with disabilities. I've already spoken to the fact that they are just 10%. So if they are 10% of this population, and if we plan on that basis as a minimum, it means that out of the 9 million voters, you only needed to accommodate 10% of the 9 million, which is 900,000. So if ECZ has the capacity to plan for 9 million voters, it cannot fail to plan for 900,000 voters in addition, or to accommodate 900,000 voters in an election. So for me, really, the issue is not that we are not engaging them, and the issue is not that our advocacy is not adequate, but the issue is, who are we talking to, and how committed are they to ensuring that the electoral process is inclusive and accessible for all persons?
And what could be the way forward to all those concerns that you have moving forward? Because you went across the country, and these are the findings that you captured.
So we have engaged the ECZ, and some of our demands to them is that, can you reassess the polling stations? Can you reassess the polling stations and put in appropriate measures to ensure that the polling venues are accessible for forthcoming elections? And when I say forthcoming elections, Innocent, I'm not speaking to the 2026 elections. Right. We have elections on the 21st of October, for example. Sure. It will be sad if we learn that those elections are not accessible. And the ECZ informed us that the Braille ballot jackets are still going to be provided in those polling stations. And we told them, can you then teach, or can you sensitize our voters in those places on how to use the Braille ballot jackets? And that is something they committed to doing. So we hope that in the forthcoming elections on the 21st of October, we are going to report or record some positives. So we shouldn't wait until a by-election comes. And for the 2026 by-elections, number one, the first thing that we require is disaggregated data on persons with disabilities, so that we know to say, where do we need materials for the visually impaired? Where do we need materials for voters on wheelchairs? Where do we need voters on crutches to be accommodated? So that is the kind of data that we need. And someone actually asked a question to say, so what happens if at a particular polling station we do not have anyone with a physical disability, but you have a visually impaired voter and you plan for that one? Then along the way you get to encounter a voter who is who has a physical disability. So our response to that is, look, we cannot, disability just comes. The same way you can have you cannot have a disability today, but you can have it tomorrow. So what we are saying is, when you have put the minimum or what is required, when you have included the person's disabilities in your planning and also in your layout of your polling venues, and an eventuality comes that a disability you did not plan for at that particular polling venue happens, you would have done your part. What we are encouraging the ECZ is that, look, at the end of the day, can we have all the different kinds of disabilities accommodated in the electoral process? But for now, let's begin with the voters, the data on the voters with disabilities. Let that be our minimum guiding feature as we strive to make all the polling venues accessible for all persons with disabilities. So that it shouldn't be an issue of, no, here we plan for visually impaired voters. Now today, after verification, we have a voter on a wheelchair, but in future we should have a situation where whether you are a voter on a wheelchair, whether you are using crutches, whether you are a visually impaired voter, you should be accommodated in the electoral process. But for now, let's make it in such a way that, based on our data, we make polling venues appropriately inclusive and accessible.
I want to take you back to one component you've talked about, but still on inclusiveness.
Yes.
You know, you did mention that you were also looking at the number of candidates or people that took part in the previous elections. You know, these are persons with disabilities. And you've mentioned there were a total was about, is it 12?
12 years on the ballot.
Exactly. All right. Which, I know that we had 16 political parties that contested. Is it 16?
Oh yes, 16.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Which among the 16 political parties adopted a good number of your members to contest on their political parties? And besides that as well, I want to find out in terms of, you've talked about the vulgar language, you know, that was spoken against your members, which you feel that disadvantaged more of your members, coupled with political violence and the likes, you know. What's the way forward with all those issues?
Okay. So first of all, I would like to explain or to mention that from the 12 candidates, 5 were adopted by the PF.
Right.
3 were adopted by the UPND.
Right.
We had 1 on the DP ticket, and the others were independent. Yes. So your question was, what's the way forward?
Yeah.
The way forward is that we are already engaging political parties. We've already engaged the UPND. So initially, before the elections, we had engaged a number of political parties. We have a scorecard, a standard scorecard that we use to assess how inclusive political parties are in their activities, like I mentioned, in their manifestos, and also in their party structures and their political party activities. So to that effect, we had the UPND and the PF that did not have disability inclusive policies initially include something in their manifestos. Now, some inclusions were really like an afterthought, you know, like these hanging lines where you say, we're going to make sure persons with disabilities are treated in this way, but without really anything detailed that someone can go away with, like where you read a line to say we're going to be inclusive of persons with disabilities in governance, but you don't explain how you're going to do that. Okay, so
that is in terms of
the party manifestos. Yes. So because of our advocacy, exactly, because of our advocacy and the work with the political parties, we saw the UPND and the PF prior to the 2021 elections redraft their manifestos to include sections on inclusiveness of persons with disabilities or inclusion of persons with disabilities. But what we have not seen is the actualization of those documents, because you find that the same party members who are guided by this particular constitution, when they have an opponent who is a person with disability, they are still speaking to them or using a disability against them. We had a candidate, for example, in the Eastern Province, who was adopted by a named political party. And the opponent political party, despite having that in their manifesto, were campaigning that candidate based on the disability. So you wanted to say, these documents, are they internalized by their own members? To what extent is their grassroots level buying into this documentation? So it's one thing to engage political parties at that level, at the decision level, making at national level, but what are they doing coming down to their structures? So what we have done now as ZAFOD is that we are administering the scorecard, where we are saying, okay, we scored you before you had this, now you had this, you have this in your document. Let's see to what extent you are implementing inclusion and disability mainstreaming in your activities, in your party structures, and in your programming, you find that they are really limping. There are only a few improvements. They still need a lot of help. And while at the national level they'll speak to inclusion, they'll speak to disability mainstreaming, on the grassroots is something else. They look at a person with disabilities as somebody without any ability at all. So they focus on the disability and not on what person with disabilities can bring to the table. We even had one testimony from one of our members to say they are a member of a named political party, and they went to take part in a campaign rally, and then they were told to say, like, there's no way you're going to go, remain here and do the cooking because of your condition. You'll get it based on the disability. And the person refused and said, no, I came here to campaign, so let me take part in the campaign activities. So we shouldn't have a situation where when you look at persons with disabilities, you want to think charity, you want to think pity. No, let's give them a chance. Let's give them a platform, because they've got so much to offer to this country. One of the candidates actually who was campaigned against on the basis of disability is actually a lecturer in one of the higher learning institutions. So this is the same person delivering lessons and getting people to acquire this knowledge at university level. But when it comes to representing you, you feel that because they cannot see, they will not represent you. Like, how does that even add up? Exactly. Yeah. How does that even add up? So we should not feel persons with disabilities fit in a certain category, but they cannot fit in representative leadership. So what we are doing about it is that we are re-engaging political parties, we are reassessing their manifestos, and we are giving recommendations. But this time around as ZAFOD, we are going to go a step further. We are not just going to give them recommendations and wait until 2026. We'll be following up to see the extent to which they're implementing those recommendations. So that come 2026 and in the subsequent by-elections from 2021, we should begin to see the actualization of inclusion, the actualization of disability mainstreaming in the political parties as well.
I remember at some point, I think it was last year, before the elections, of course, in 2019, we had, some constitutional reforms, proposals that came on board of wanting to refine the constitution. And I remember more especially those people or leaders from the Patriotic Front. They really campaigned that the Bill 10, for example, was a very good document, because it was going to ensure that much of your members, or most of your members, were going to be given a very fair platform for them to contest in an election. And unfortunately, that bill didn't go through. Do you think that was a bill that you really maybe anticipated as ZAFOD to go through?
Okay. So I think what I'm going to mention is that I'm not going to make a comment on the bill in totality, but what I'm going to mention is the fact that, yes, it did contain one aspect that we're fully in support of as ZAFOD, and that was proportional representation. Up until this day, as ZAFOD, we're still advocating for the adoption of a mixed member electoral system. You see, in a mixed member electoral system, Innocent, it's a system that deliberately guarantees that marginalized groups within our population have got representation in parliament. As regards persons with disabilities, for example, the mixed member electoral system was going to ensure that a number of seats are reserved to persons with disabilities to compete amongst themselves, and the winners making it to parliament. We still feel that is the best way to go, because if we had that type of representation, this time around at National Assembly level, we're not going to be talking about our representation dwindling from 1.6% in 2016 to only 0.6% in 2021. At local government level, we moved from over 2% to 0.25% only. And we don't know the extent to which these members that have made it will manage to influence the laws, the policies in favor of persons with disabilities. And also we thought, or we're hopeful, that as the president nominated the 8 members of parliament, he was going to include someone with disabilities. Because, I mean, just as he got elected, he made a pronouncement that he's going to run an inclusive government. So, but what we have seen mainly is regional inclusivity. On the part of the citizens, the women, persons with disabilities, we are still very far behind. But we are still hopeful that as he concludes his appointments within the different governance structures, we are going to see representations of persons with disabilities, because they are also citizens of this country. And of course, maybe they are in a minority and largely marginalized group, but their voice is still needed. They still need representation. So we'll still speak to the fact that we require some electoral reforms that will bring in the mixed member electoral system, so that we shouldn't rely on goodwill to have representation of our members in parliament or in decision-making positions. Instead, we should have guaranteed representation, so that at any given time, we feel we have people, we have members from within ourselves speaking to our issues.
Don't you think that discrimination is in different forms? Let's say, for example, if we are going to refine the constitution and maybe allocate certain seats for persons with disabilities, and I don't know if. For me, I feel that maybe that could be another form of discriminating the people, because you want to treat these people to be very special than the other, citizenly, or you want to treat these people to be, not special. It depends which side you want to pick.
Okay.
Why can't you just leave a fair platform for everybody, for as long as there's no violence, for as long as there are no any form of insults or vulgar language during the campaigns?
Okay, so Innocent, this is not actually discrimination, and this is not exclusion, but this is actually ensuring that, come what may, persons with disabilities have got representation. Why do we want a mixed member electoral system? It's because the electoral environment, like I've explained to you, is not fair. It's not inclusive yet. Right. For it to be completely inclusive, we need to change a lot of things, including attitudes of the members of the public. I'll give you an example. If you walked into this building and you found me seated, I'm a person with disability, but you don't know, how are you going to treat me? And then the moment you realize that actually for me to stand or for me to walk, I use a walking aid, maybe I've hidden it here, how is your perception going to change? You like it or not, Innocent, we've all gone through this process where you didn't realize somebody was a person with a disability. Then as they stand or as they walk away, you realize your attitude certainly changes in one way or another. Either you become pitiful or you regret maybe an action you did. There's always that reaction. Now, that just tells you that for us to change our perception, whereby when you see a person with disability or a person with disability, no reaction goes on in you, like you don't get moved, but you just look at them the same. That is the point at which we can say, can we compete fairly? Because it means at that point, our attitudes have changed so much that we are no longer looking at our brothers and sisters as marginalized or as being incapable, but we are looking at them as being equal and as being like anybody else. But right now, we can't talk about that. So until we do that, can we make sure that they've got guaranteed representation? And the only way we can ensure that is by making, by putting in place a system that allows them to compete only amongst themselves. So they're still going to be the larger part, to be a part of the larger parliament, if you like. And as ZAFOD, we're only recommending a 10-quota system where 10 seats are reserved for persons with disabilities to compete amongst themselves. How many seats do we have in parliament? We have over 150. So if persons with disabilities take 10, and then later in parliament, they work with the other members of parliament, I don't think would have taken away anything. And that is not exclusion, but at least we'll make sure that they've got a voice in parliament. As it stands right now, let's go with a fair play. So you are competing. You and me are competing as candidates. We don't have disabilities. Nobody's speaking to our bodies. Nobody's speaking to our capabilities or incapabilities. But the moment we have a person with a disability, then their opponent starts to say, so this person who is blind, how are they going to lead you? They blindfold the member to say, can you walk? And they put a barrier in front of that person. So the member walks a few steps and falls, and then they say, that is how this visually impaired person is going to represent you in parliament if you allow them to go. Before they even reach parliament, at arcades there, they'll fall. And how are your representation, how are your views, how are your voices as a constituency, as a council, going to reach parliament? So this person with disability is not only overcoming or is not only convincing voters to vote for them on the basis of ideas. They also have to convince voters by overcoming the stigma that is shown at them because of their disability. So in such a situation, you can't guarantee a fair win. You can't guarantee fair play. So saying that they should compete as everybody else, yes, that's something that they are willing to do. But is the environment ready for that type of competition? The answer is no. And until we are ready, how then do we guarantee that they've got representation? Right now, we are crying to the appointments of the president, or we are appealing to the appointments of the president. Why? Because we are not there. Are you telling me that if we had 10% representation in parliament, or if we had even just 10 members in parliament, we would be speaking to the president to consider us in his appointments? No, because we would have enough voices to speak to our issues. So we don't want to leave it to goodwill. we don't want to leave it to somebody's prerogative, if you like.
Yeah.
We want it to happen because we recognize that we have a system that is a bit rigid or that is not very accommodative, and we're trying to make sure that every member is being represented. So the ones that are marginalized, let's give them a chance, so they don't leave it to chance.
Manager, why do you want your members, really, why do you want representation either at parliament level or maybe cabinet level? What is it that you want to achieve on behalf of your members? Because you kept on emphasizing we want our members to go there and represent us. Because what kind of representation which you feel that is not existing at the moment?
Okay. So I'll give you an example, Innocent.
Yeah.
Earlier on, you gave me an example of even just buildings in this country, how they're being built. Who at the planning stage is even speaking to the fact that, can you make these buildings accessible? Do you know that in this country we have hospitals that are not accessible? Even though hospitals are supposed to have wheelchairs mobile, you find that a hospital, to access it, you are going upstairs. Now imagine you are a person with disability. On top of that, you have an ailment. So the reason why we need representation is that we are citizens of this country. So you and me are being represented. And we are not saying that our leaders are not adequate. But to what extent are they speaking to our issues? Today, even the women movement in Zambia is crying for representation in cabinet, in decision-making positions. Is it that we don't have women there? They are there, but they are not adequate to influence policy change. So we shouldn't have a situation where persons with disability take dominance as if they are only citizens in this country. So let us have a voice also of persons with disability, because they are citizens of this country. And by being citizens of this country, we know that we have a right to choose leaders to put in positions of leadership to preside over our issues. So if we're going to talk disability, let us have someone with disabilities also contributing to the voice of those that are presiding over our affairs as a nation. So yes, we need representation because we're citizens.
What guarantee do you have that if, for example, you are going to have maybe 3 or 4 members of parliament coming from your organization, they were going to be able to represent you or your voices adequately compared to what has been done in the past? I can give an example. In the past, maybe we had Honorable Nixon Chilangwa, you know, and
He's still there, actually.
exactly.
Still in Parliament.
Honorable Chilangwa has been a member of Parliament for quite some time under Luapula, you know, constituents. And again, we had Honorable Copeland as well, was in Parliament last year, you know, but we had less kind of, advocacy on your behalf, on behalf of your members as well. Would you say that really, if 1 or 2 people that are affected somehow, again, they fail to represent their fellow members, I mean, what guarantee do you have that, if, for example, if maybe 2 or 3 people are going to sit in Parliament or at Cabinet, things are going to change overnight?
Okay. So, Innocent, at the end of the day, the leaders that we choose, me and you, at the point of choice, we have no guarantee whatsoever that they will represent us.
Right.
Because them asking for our votes to get there and them saving us are 2 different things. But we are hopeful because we've seen our members speak to the issues that affect us and walk the talk. As ZAFOD, for example, our own director is a person with disabilities. He speaks on these issues and he walks the talk. So we are hopeful that from that background, we are going to, when we have a voice of our own, it's going to speak to our issues. Because we've seen how persons with disabilities at different levels of society, different levels of governance within the society are able to champion our own issues and make a change, make a difference. So we are hopeful. Well, we cannot say it's guaranteed, but we are hopeful that they will do that. But also for the ones that have passed, you're saying, to what extent have they represented us? Yeah. Now, my response to that, Innocent, is that at the end of the day, representation of persons with disabilities should not only be left to persons with disabilities themselves. Right. It should be the concern of you and me, because disabilities affect all of us. And if you are not a person with a disability tomorrow, you are potentially today, you are potentially a person with a disability tomorrow. So it should concern you because you don't know at what point you need or you'll be referred to as a person with a disability. So it's not an issue of having persons with disabilities only speaking to issues of disability, but we need to be inclusive. So we can have the person with disabilities begin the agenda or chart the agenda, but everybody else should join in because disability is an issue that concerns everybody. But most importantly, persons with disabilities are citizens just like you and me. So if you and me require representation that is adequate, persons with disabilities also have a voice that needs to be heard.
Would you give a summary to this discussion by stating that persons with ability or with the
without
able-bodied
disabilities,
individuals, yes, without a disability, they are failed to represent your members? Would you give that summary?
I think the summary I will give is that the electoral, political, and governance processes of this country are not inclusive of persons with disabilities. Right. We are yet to see inclusion, meaningful inclusion, and disability mainstreaming in this country. And this is why I've mentioned to all these different levels, these different programmings, and also even how our infrastructure is not disability friendly. So the processes, programming, different levels of governance, political activities, electoral processes in this country are yet to be inclusive of persons with disabilities. At the rate we are going, we are not yet inclusive of persons with disabilities. And to achieve that, we need to begin to mainstream disability in our planning and in our programming. The budget will be presented on the 29th of October. Sure. We are hopeful as ZAFOD that the Ministry of Finance will take a lead in ensuring that we have resources throughout throughout the structures of government in all the sectors to mainstream disability at the planning stage. Issues of persons with disability should not come as an afterthought because they are equal citizens of this country who should enjoy equal rights like everybody else. So their issues of disability should not be an afterthought, and they should not be an issue of appeasement. We are not asking, Innocent. We are not requesting. We are demanding.
It's a demand. Because
it's an issue, the issue of us being included is an issue of our rights. So when it comes to our rights, we are not going to request. We are not going to ask. We are not going to beg for consideration. We are going to demand. So we are demanding to say, can the governance processes, electoral processes, political processes, can we just have disability mainstreamed across all planning and programming? Can we have persons with disabilities included in all aspects of governance in this country because they are citizens and because it borders on their rights?
All right. Do you think that we need to sanitize our politics in Zambia, looking at what we've just submitted, the issue of attacks on your members verbally during the previous campaigns, and that did not only affect your members, by the way, but including other candidates. Remember that we had a lot of vulgar languages during the elections. Issues to do with others went on tribal, campaigning on tribal basis. All those things like that, coupled with political violence. What can we do to move away from all these, attacks on personalities and begin to focus on matters that matter the most to your life, my life, and the lives of the people that are watching us right now, moving forward?
Okay. So we need a lot of changes in attitudes, attitudinal changes, changes in perception. And so to speak to some of these changes that we need to see, we need to raise a lot of awareness around equality in participation. But also, it's very important that the leaders of this country take it upon themselves to make politics more issue-based. It shouldn't be about personalities, but it should be about what we're able to bring to the table. The moment we begin to focus on our abilities, on our contributions, we'll even be better placed to work together. And in such a situation, believe you me, Innocent, we will not sit here and start saying persons with disabilities are not included in the governance structure. Why? Because we'll look at ourselves as equal citizens. And before we even come to who has a disability or who doesn't have, the environment would have created a fair play for everybody that is inclusive, embracing of everybody. So what we need really is a lot of awareness raising. We need to continue, if anything, increase on our advocacy. And also, we need to begin to yield accepting attitudes towards one another as citizens. We should not allow politics. We should not allow disabilities. We should not allow particular affiliations to separate us or to make us look down on the others, because at the end of the day, one thing stands: we are citizens of this country.
I've covered, some of your members in the past, during their protest, and I've gotten to listen to most of their concerns that have been raising regarding how they want to be governed, and with regards to the representation. Others have gone further that maybe they want somebody who is not to be represented by a person without disability, a person like, for example, myself, who is able-bodied, but they want only to be represented by themselves, persons with disabilities. Have you resolved those issues that have been going on or flying around?
The issues of, say, maybe if I have a physical disability, I want someone with a physical disability.
Yeah.
Well, in every institution, Innocent, there will always be infights. But I think at the end of the day, as a disability movement, what I can mention is that what holds us together is greater than what splits us. I think at the end of the day, the consistent message that we are sharing out there is we want representation, we want inclusion. I think those are the two consistent messages that we are sharing. So the infights will always be there. Maybe they are bordering on personalities, they are bordering on different issues, dissatisfaction. But one thing that I do know is that when it comes to inclusion, we stand on the same ground. When it comes to representation, we all are seeking that. Yes.
Besides the things you've just mentioned, I'll give you this chance to highlight some of the challenges that your members are facing, besides the issue of them wanting to fairly participate into politics. What are some of the critical matters that your members are facing, persons with disabilities? And I'll keep on reminding you some of the challenges that your members are facing, because I've covered them several times personally.
Okay. The challenges are many, like I said. One of them is that the barriers within the environment. Okay. The other one is that we don't have accepting attitudes among fellow citizens on the representation, on the participation of persons with disabilities in politics. We tend to feel that persons with disabilities should lead a certain type of life away from the public domain, if you like, and politics are considered something for the public. So we feel that should not be reserved for them. I don't know for what reasons, but sometimes the reasons people advance is that, look, you have a disability, how safe is that place for you? So now you suppose there's this and that. No, what we should look at is, yes, you have a disability, but what can you do well? Let's focus on their abilities, because you and me, Innocent, just because we do not have disabilities today does not mean that we have it all in each and every aspect of life, or in each and every. We are not experts in everything. So what makes us think that just because someone has one particular impairment that limits them from going about life in a certain way, then automatically they cannot contribute anything. So that is one of the barriers. I think the attitudes that we have towards these people really it covers a number of barriers, in the sense that if we had to just have acceptable attitudes, the other barriers would actually come off. Today, if I speak to the ECZ and tell them, can you make the electoral process more inclusive of persons with disabilities, they are going to tell me they don't have resources. But suppose I tell the ECZ to say, okay, since you don't have resources to make the electoral process more inclusive for persons with disabilities, then let's not hold this election until persons with disabilities are included. What's going to happen? Obviously, they're going to respond in the affirmative, because they can't afford to postpone an election. So it's really an issue of attitude. It's an issue of perception. So that is what we need to change. Another barrier is that when we talk about accessibility, it really goes across. It's not just in the environment. It's not just in the venues. It borders on a lot of issues. The health sector, the education sector. How accessible is it for persons with disabilities? Do they have all the medicines that they need? Do they have all the materials that they need? Do they have all the aids that they require to learn? So when we talk about accessibility, it's not restricted to buildings or environments. It's included even in policies. okay, programming, government planning, all these different aspects that make life what it is in our country today has got issues that persons with disabilities have to overcome in order for them to enjoy the same facilities that you and me enjoy without any issues.
Have you made an attempt maybe to see the president the last 1 month he's been in office and begin to engage him?
Yes, we have.
Some of these.
We have written to the president,
Yeah.
though we have not received a response yet,
Right.
but we'll continue to engage government. We are hoping to meet the vice president by the end of this week.
Right.
So, but other than that, like I said, we're already meeting political parties. We have already engaged the ECZ. We are continuing to engage civil society organizations like ourselves so that we speak from a stronger point of view together. And also we'll continue to advocate as ZAFOD. But in terms of engaging the government, that's one of our priorities, even though up until now we have not yet had secured an appointment successfully. But
How
we
is
are
the
working on
morale
that.
among some of your members that contested in the last elections?
Oh, I'm glad you asked.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. The morale is very low. I'm not going to hide that.
Right.
Some of the candidates have actually vowed never to stand again. So we are speaking to them. There's a lot of counseling going on, and there's a lot of encouragement going on. So even as we speak to issues of sensitization, issues of advocacy, issues of capacity building in political participation, our members are also our targets. We are talking to them and telling them, say, look, you may have faced this defeat, you may have overcome this kind of harassment, this kind of messages, but it doesn't end there. As we change the attitudes of the people, let us continue to participate until the environment actually accepts us. So if they cannot accept us by changing their attitudes, then they should accept us because they've been seeing us over and over, and they've just reached a point where they can no longer continue to reject us. So it's a mammoth task, really, because if the ones that stood are discouraged from standing further, how much more then are those that never stood going to even attempt to stand, having seen what their colleagues had to overcome? So it's really negative in terms of them participating again, but we do know that it's something that can be changed.
All right. Madam Soko, allow me to appreciate you for coming, and
Thank you so much.
I'm glad that you found time to come and speak to the people of Zambia, giving us a new dimension of a discussion altogether, to get to listen to different concerns coming from your members. These are persons with disabilities.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Innocent, and thanks so much to the viewers for listening to us. So as ZAFOD, we are calling on you to work with us, and also to begin to see the abilities of persons with disabilities. Let us allow them to participate freely in the political space, because they have so much to offer, and persons with disabilities are human beings just like you and me. So just because you don't have a disability today does not mean that you never have it, but also it does not mean that a person with a disability cannot represent other citizens. So we are citizens just like yourselves. Please give us a chance. Or we have never just had equal opportunities, but we have so much to offer. We have so much, so many capabilities. So please tap into our potential and don't look at our disability, but rather focus on that which we can contribute to. Thank you so much.